Welcome back to East and West, a show for helping us keep our spiritual bearings as we navigate this world around us. Wes Young here with a bonus episode. It's going to be a sermon delivered in Cochran, Georgia, just at the start of the new year, 2024. And I want to pair this sermon with a special announcement. I finally have, after 2 or 3 years of hard work, I finally have a book to release again. This will be my second book, and the title is One Story Building. It is coming out, Lord willing, this month. And actually, the sermon that you're about to listen to is inspired by that 2 or 3 year journey of writing this book, which is on the power of stories and the power of story in our lives. So the sermon sort of rolled out of that in interesting ways. I hope you enjoy the sermon, and if it is a topic that you're interested in and you want the book version of it, filled with a lot of funny stories from my coming of age years and so forth, I hope you'll give the book a try when it releases. The title is One Story Building. That's one story, comma, building. But you can find everything you need, links and places to purchase it on my website, wesyoungwriter.com. It'll be for sale in the usual online retailers, Amazon, Barnes & Noble, etc. But you can find all the links and options at wesyoungwriter.com. And actually, my website is the only place you'll be able to get an autographed version. So if you'd like a signed copy of the book, again, when it comes out later this month, it'll be on wesyoungwriter.com. Be glad to do that. It's going to be a hardback edition, which is a different. My first novel was paperback. Reaching Soul was a paperback. This one, we're going hardback. And I know this is a nerdy thing to be excited about, but I was just recently issued, I was going to say awarded, but that's not quite right. It's issued a Library of Congress number from the United States government. How cool is that? So I now have, for this new book anyway, a Library of Congress number, which is probably not that exciting. I don't think anyone pulled their car over right now listening to this so that they could do a happy dance in the road. But that was my reaction to it. I thought it was super cool. What it short version means is that the new book can actually be available in the public library systems for what it's worth. But anyway, no, actually, don't listen to that. You need to buy your own copy, and I hope you will. All right, anyway, enough delay, enough talk. I hope you enjoy this sermon, and I hope it gives you a little taste of what that book will be about. Blessings to you all, and may the stories you tell yourself and the stories you tell your children be true. Amen. Here we go. Y'all like a Bible story? I have a Bible story for you. If you have a Bible with you or near you, it's in the book of Acts, chapter 21. And I promise I will read the whole story, but I want to hang us on one verse and let everything reside on that. So if you've made it to Acts 21, scroll down all the way to verse 34. We're in Jerusalem, and there's a turmoil, a riot has broken out, and this Roman commander burst in to try to figure out what's going on in the streets. There's trouble in the streets. And all the trouble seems to center around this one guy, and he doesn't know who he is. But the commander burst in, and verse 34 of chapter 21, some in the crowd shouted one thing and some another. That sounds about right for a riot, doesn't it? Shouting, and they're shouting different things. One shouted one thing, one shouted another. And since the commander could not get at the truth because of the uproar, he ordered that Paul be taken into the barracks. The commander could not get at the truth because of the uproar. Join me in prayer, please. Heavenly Father, I pray, God, that in this quiet place and this time set aside to focus all of our attention and all of our energies on you in a noisy, noisy world, I pray that you will bless this effort and let us not miss your word, and may your word not return void. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. Life is my experience with life is exactly that verse. Because of the uproar, we can't get at the truth. I feel for that commander, what that must have been like. And the uproar, the noise around us in this world, one version of reality, another version, this story version, this version, this truth and that truth. And with all the noise, can you imagine growing up in such a noisy place from the get-go? I'm glad I wasn't born yesterday. And I've told people this several times, and it's not the kids' fault. But I'm glad I grew up as I had my childhood pre-cell phone. I'm happy about that. It means that I didn't have a lot of junk inundating me all the time. I didn't have the internet walking around with me in my pocket. And so it was still an uproarious world that I grew up in. I was a 90s child, born in the late 80s, grew up in the 90s, and it was noisy. Maybe when some of you were kids, television had one channel. You know, my dad talks about that. Or for all I know, maybe television wasn't invented when you were born. I don't know. You have to figure that out yourself. But we had 20, 30, 60 channels by the time the 90s rolled around. It was a noisy world. But it's only gotten louder, hasn't it? And he could not get at the truth because of the uproar. There was a band in the early 90s called Nirvana, and they had their most famous song was Smells Like Teen Spirit. It's a weird little song named after a deodorant, as I understand it. And I don't think that when that song topped the charts, I don't think the band really knew how there's a line in it that is exactly the anthem of Generation Z, the Gen Z. That it was probably unintentional that they put this line in there, or they didn't know how prophetic it was going to be. But there's a line in that song that says, "Here we are, now entertain us." And that pretty well sums up, I hate to sound like, I hate to sound too classical, but that pretty much sums up kids nowadays. Here we are, now entertain us. But through all of that, the uproar has grown so loud and the stories are so varied, the stories of reality are so varied, people don't know what to believe anymore. And it's not just entertainment. When I say stories, you may immediately think of, some books that you've read or movies that you enjoyed or television shows or songs or whatever. And that is certainly where we get stories. And a lot of times that is strictly entertainment. It's not that often that you watch a television show for education. A lot of times you just need something to do after a hard day of work. But through it, you get story. But it's more than that. It's more than just entertainment. The story that you tell of your life, the story that you tell of your existence, it determines everything that you do. An illustration that I like to use to try to get this point across, especially as a literature teacher, I'm always trying to help people understand the importance of story and having a right relationship to story. But imagine a group of castaways. They found themselves shipwrecked or whatever on a deserted island, and they have to make decisions as a group for their survival. If you think about them on that deserted island, what story they adopt, the narrative that they tell themselves, is going to have immense practical implications as to what they do next. I don't want to hear any more talk about science and math or practical. English and history are just fun and maybe interesting or just something you have to do to get a diploma. I don't want to hear any more talk about that. There's nothing more practical than history and literature, because the history that you believe and your way of understanding it and the stories that we tell one another about how we got here and where we're going and why we're here in the first place, that pragmatically determines everything that we make. It determines whether we build a sword or a plowshare, or if you want to modernize that a little bit, a tank or a tractor. It depends on what story you believe. So you've got these islanders, and they have to adopt a story. Now let's suppose the story they adopt is that the mainland, salvation, is just over the horizon. If that's the story that they adopt, what are they going to spend their energies doing? Building a raft. Because it's just right over there. What's the horizon? It's not as far as you would think, 7 or 14 miles, something like that. They would build a raft. If that's the story they adopt, they're going to dedicate all of their energies to building a raft. On the other hand, let's give them a different story. What if the story that they adopt is that big mountain inland a bit is actually a volcano? It's going to erupt and wipe us out soon. They're not going to spend time building planting a garden, are they? What good would it do? You could get even more bizarre. What if the story that they adopt is that they were actually placed on this island by some sort of subterfuge, and one of them is a murderer, and the reason they're here in the first place is they're about all to be murdered? That would change the way that they live. They'd be very suspicious of one another, sleep with one eye open, or put somebody on watch, but you hope it's not the somebody who's the murderer, and so forth. The stories that you believe completely determine the thing that you do next. And I think misunderstanding that is to put yourself in a very vulnerable position in a world that is so uproarious that you cannot get at the truth because of the uproar. All right, so I promised you a Bible story. Here it is. Let's read the whole story. Back up to verse 30. No, let's back up further than that. Let's back up all the way to verse 26. 26. Same chapter, Acts 21. Let's start in verse 26. I'll give you the whole story. It's a really good story. They're in Jerusalem. The next day, Paul, the Apostle Paul, he's preaching the gospel at this point, spreading and building the church. He took the men and purified himself along with them, and then he went to the temple to give notice of the date when the days of purification would end and the offering would be made for each of them. So Paul is in Jerusalem, and he starts doing very Jewish things. He takes a purification rite. He goes through a Jewish ritual. He's got a rather checkered name among the Jews. They're not sure what he's doing with this whole Jesus thing, and they're worried about it. They're worried that he's maybe trying to defile their temple or take away their position or whatever. But Paul was a Jew among Jews, as he said. He was top tier. And so he tries to go along with that culturally. As Paul says elsewhere, I've become all things to all men so that by doing so I could win a few to Christ. That's what verse 26 is about. Verse 27, when the 7 days were nearly over, some Jews from the province of Asia saw Paul at the temple. And they stirred up the whole crowd and seized him, shouting, "Men of Israel, help us! This is the man who teaches all men everywhere against our people and our law and this place, this temple. And besides, he has brought Greeks or Gentiles into the temple and defiled this holy place." All right, so there you go. Version 1 of the story. That's the crowd's version. He's against Judaism. He's anti-Jew, anti-Semitic. He has defiled the temple. He's bringing Gentiles into the holy place, which is a total no-no. And he has disgraced it, and he's trying to bring everything to ruin that we stand. That's their version of the story. You ever been slandered wrongly before? It hurts. For someone to tell the wrong version of your story is a very painful thing. We even call lying, sometimes we call it a story. Are you telling me a story? And I kind of see why we do that. What it implies is, are you telling the wrong story? Oh, no, that window was broken when I went by there. And then I dropped my baseball in the it's that kind. Are you telling me a story? Well, this is their version of the story. And it's totally wrong. If you go back any of the 10 verses that preceded where we started, and even verse 26 that I did read to you, he was being very Jewish. He was doing things exactly right. He was not defiling anything. And as far as this business of he brought Gentiles into the temple, look at verse 29. It's in parentheses, which I just think is great. They had previously seen Trophimus the Ephesian, the Gentile, the Greek, in the city with Paul, and assumed that Paul had brought him into the temple area. There's that word, right? Assumed. I had a wonderful teacher, Dale Jones. When I was in middle school, he taught health. And I know he didn't invent this quote, but he's the first and only person I've ever heard say it. And I was in middle school, and I still remember it, 20 years later or whatever. He said, don't believe anything you hear and only half of what you see. And I have really held on to that. That's wise words. They saw Paul with Trophimus and assumed. You think you could trust only believe half of what you see. He didn't bring Trophimus into the temple. They assumed that Paul had brought him in. Anyway, they just wanted something, so they're telling stories about Paul. Verse 30, the story gets more and more heated. The whole city was aroused. The people came running from all directions. Now that's the point to make right there. The whole city was aroused. The whole city was fired up, flamed up. It's like those islanders. What happened that fired them up? It was because they adopted a story. Story changes what we do. When Charles Dickens came out in the 1800s with that famous novel, A Christmas Carol, I mean, it's a short little book. Ebenezer Scrooge and the Ghost and all that. Bestseller from the time it hit shelves that Christmas. It was his Christmas gift to London, he called it. And charitable giving skyrocketed shortly thereafter. Tell me that story doesn't exactly and perfectly affect the things that we do. You read that book about Ebenezer Scrooge and you start thinking, I don't want to be this guy. You give to charity. And so it can have a positive effect, a very positive effect. And that book, incidentally, I teach that book every Christmas to my students. So I reread it every year to them. And that has had a cleansing effect on me, I think, against greed and just general nastiness, like an Ebenezer Scrooge kind of character. The examples abound. Hemingway comes out with The Sun Also Rises, the bullfighting book in Spain, or the Running with the Bulls, bullfighting in Spain. And the very next year, more people got killed by the bulls because it was so crowded they couldn't run away from them. Why was it so crowded? Because Hemingway wrote a book and told a story that got everybody interested in it. I've been told that Duck Dynasty has ruined duck hunting because it's so crowded now. Whereas used to, you had your duck hunters, just people that were into it for whatever reason, but now everybody wants to be a duck hunter. Pontiac Trans Am sales skyrocketed after Smokey and the Bandit. You get the point that I'm trying to make. The city was aroused. They were fired up, and it's because they picked a story to hang on to. Seizing Paul, they dragged him from the temple, and immediately the gates were shut. While they were trying to kill him, now there's a flat news flash, isn't it? The story was so powerful, they're seizing a man, trying to kill a man, and I bet my bottom dollar most of the crowd, the mob mentality, don't even know why. But it's some story that they've adopted. And it caught fire and it spread. Can anybody say social media? It caught fire and it spread, and most of the people that shared it, liked it, clicked on it, adopted it, believed it, don't have a clue what really happened. While they were trying to kill him, news reached the commander, remember him, of the Roman troops, that the whole city of Jerusalem was in an uproar. He at once took some officers and soldiers and ran down to the crowd. When the rioters saw the commander and his soldiers, they stopped beating Paul. Like, oh, we're caught. Hang on a second. Now the commander came up and arrested him. Now this was the olden days. Things undoubtedly were different 2,000 years ago in the Roman Empire. You come up across a gang of people beating up one person now, I think you would probably arrest the gang, right? Not so the Romans. They arrest the guy getting beat up. That's just such a different turn. I guess they figured he must have done something if everybody's trying to kill him. Let's arrest him. So they arrest Paul, bound him with 2 chains. And then they asked who he was and what he had done. Like, give me your story, Paul. What's your story? What's the story here? Some in the crowd shouted one thing and some another, and since the commander could not get at the truth because of the uproar, he ordered that Paul be taken to the barracks. When Paul reached the steps, the violence of the mob was so great, he had to be carried by the soldiers. They want to question him and can't because of all the noise. You can apply that analogy to a lot of things. The crowd that followed kept shouting, "Away with him! Away with him." They're shouting. If you can't be smart, at least be loud, right? What did Pontius Pilate ask about Jesus? Crucify him. What crime has he committed? And their reply, this is classic stupid. Their reply was, if he hadn't done something wrong, we wouldn't have turned him over to you. You think that'll hold up in a real court, in an honest court? No. Even Judge Judy could have caught that one. Obviously, they don't have anything on this guy. And they shouted all the louder, "Crucify him! Crucify him!" Never giving a reason why. So they're just shouting, "Away with him." As the soldiers were about to take Paul into the barracks, he asked the commander, "May I say something? May I tell my story? May I say something to you?" And apparently when he said that, I'm assuming the crowd may have been speaking Hebrew or Aramaic, but when Paul said this, he speaks it in Greek. And the commander says, "Do you speak Greek?" He replied, "Aren't you the Egyptian who started a revolt and led 4,000 terrorists out into the desert some time ago?" So he has no idea what's going on. This commander did not get the memo. "Aren't you the Egyptian who led the terrorists?" I bet even Paul chuckled at that. Well, I guess under the circumstances, maybe, but he had to be thinking, what? Where'd you get that story from? So the people in the street have their story. He's defiling the temple. The commander has this Egyptian terrorist story, which is rather bizarre. And Paul hasn't had a chance to tell his story at all, but he did ask in Greek, "Can I say something?" And so Paul in verse 39, almost done with the story, finally gets a chance. He says, Paul answered, "I'm a Jew from Tarsus in Cilicia, a citizen of no ordinary city. Please let me speak to the people." And having received the commander's permission, Paul stood on the steps and motioned to the crowd. Okay, and so that's kind of where our story ends. Though I got to tell you, the book of Acts is wildly entertaining and interesting. It's about as good as they get as far as action-packed Bible books go, the book of Acts. But we're going to end our story there. He gets a chance to explain himself to the crowd. The point I'm trying to make is that the commander could not get at the truth because of the uproar. And I want us to be more and more conscious than ever as we grow up in a noisy world that the stories we adopt fixate the reality that we live by. We're like those islanders. And the different things that we believe about our existence are going to change the way we approach our existence. All right, second point. Why do we need a story to do that? Why can't we just get to the facts? And the answer is because you and I are limited. We've got the 2 eyes, the 2 ear thing. We're limited in space. All of us, like our geographical location. You can't be here and there at the same time. And so here we are in a Baptist church on a Sunday morning in a sanctuary in Cochran, Georgia. I am not anywhere else right now. And so my acceptance of reality requires a certain story to be told. I've been told all kinds of stories throughout my life. I was told in elementary school that the world is round. I'm good with that. I think we have that right. But I've never seen it that way. I've never been to space and looked at it. I've seen pictures. But I accept that story. I've been told the story that the world was alive and well before me. In 1987, when I came onto the scene, as I understand it from the history books, people had already been here. It didn't all begin when Wes Young began. I have no evidence of that in and of myself. I wasn't there in that space, in that location, but I take it as a fact. And so I'm limited to space. I'm limited to time. What do these people in this story have their limits? They're in their geographical space. They're in Jerusalem. They can assume that there is Italy because they know they've been conquered by the Romans, and they hear the tales of Rome and the grandeur of Rome, which is and they understand there must be this Italy over there, and I even have a cousin who went over there or whatever. They have whatever stories they have, but they have to believe that this other country has conquered us. They have invaded and taken, and that's our story, and we're sticking to it. And we don't like it. Was the Jews' reaction to that? You think they wanted to be colonized and conquered? Does anybody? And so that was their story, which is probably why they were so sensitive to an intruder, Paul, who was going to tear down the Israeli national religious pride that they had. you could kind of see why they might be sensitive on that issue. We're limited in time. Nobody was around. None of us in this room were around when George Washington was around. But we've been told the story. We've been told the story of these colonists who didn't like the way things were being handled overseas and decided to be their own nation. And there was leaders and generals and Minutemen and patriots who fought their way to freedom, and here we are. That's the story, and we're sticking to it. Well, what's the story for these guys? The story in this situation is the other way around. We Jews were once on top. We were God's chosen people. We had the house and line of David. We were supposed to be the leaders of the promised land, this little Palestinian strip of geography. We were supposed to have it. That is our history. We take that, and even the word history has story in it. That's our story. And so here come these Romans taking that power away from us, and here comes this guy desecrating that heritage. You could see why they might be a little touchy about that, because it's the story that they had adopted. And then the last way that we're limited as humans is our perspective, which is kind of a combination of the first two. We're limited in space. Here we are in this sanctuary. I can't also be in Eastman right now, but I assume that Eastman exists, and that's the story I believe in. I don't believe it disappeared when I left it. We're limited in time. I never met George Washington, but I'm good with believing that. I never lived in 1986, for example, but I believe there was a 1986. Some of y'all can testify to that for me. It really did exist. People really were on earth, even though I've never seen it. We're limited in perspective. They saw him with Trophimus and assumed from their perspective, oh, you're taking that Greek to the temple. I know you are. That's my perspective. Don't believe anything you hear and only half of what you see, right? I remember one time I was in Macon, Georgia, nighttime with my wife. We're at Barnes & Noble, which is my favorite place in Macon, about the only place I'd really want to go in Macon. It's a good bookstore. And we're walking back to the car, and she was behind. She had fallen behind for whatever reason. Maybe she was talking to some friends that were with us or whatever. So I'm kind of walking alone ahead to the car. And something hits me really hard in the top of the head. Just bink! It was a quarter. Fell out of the sky, hit me in the head. Bink! Hurt too. It had been zipped. It's a weird thing. And behind me, a guy says, a stranger, a guy I don't know, just a guy on the streets of Macon says, got him. Now, what would you assume? I was dumbstruck. And you turn around and this guy got him. And my wife is laughing her head off further back behind me, the stranger. What had happened was, being the jokester that she is, she had thrown the quarter and hit me in the head with it. She's a good aim with those sorts of things. Softball player. Nailed me right in the head. Thought it was the funniest thing in the world. The other guy who had saw what had happened just thought it was funny. And he was congratulating her. You got him. You see what I mean? Our perspective can't always be trusted, even when it seems like an open and shut case like that one. Look, the person who beat the horn at you in traffic, before you road rage them, maybe they were just listening to a good song on the radio and bumped it when they were, playing the drums on the steering wheel. You don't know. Give some grace, because perspective ain't everything. But it is so important to get our story straight in the good way. It is so important to adopt an accurate story that I think the limits of our perspective are something we just have to be careful about. They saw him with Trophimus, and they assumed. Perspectives change depending on where you're standing. My wife knew the whole story because of where she was standing. I didn't know the whole story because of my limited perspective. It changes perspective depends on what side you're on. I mentioned George Washington earlier. We would call him a founding father. You know what an Englishman would call him? A traitor, right? Treasonous. But to the victor go the spoils, and who wins the war gets to write the history books, and so here we are. Depending on what side you're on. Do you think Hamas is telling the same story about the Palestinian geography right now that a Jew would be telling? Do you think Hamas and the nation of Israel are telling the same version of events on that day of the first attack or the events of the war since? No. And it's a question of perspective. And it is so important to have some sort of objective truth, something outside of all of our limited human perceptions that we can build our lives on. One story, this solid, foundational truth. And that is, of all the comforting things about God's existence, that's one of the big ones. In the beginning, God. The first words of the Bible. We can start with that, and all of reality can build safely on that sure footing. Jesus said, if you take my words, right, my story, if you take my words and put them into practice, you're like a man who builds his house on the solid rock. And it's going to be uproarious. There's going to be wind and waves and storms. And so we know all that. We know life, noisy life. But that house will stand because its firm foundation is on the rock. And that is the holiness of God, that He's real outside of our limited perspectives. I was at an English teacher conference once. Sounds entertaining, doesn't it? And it was from a part of the country where people may not see things the way I do. And so the keynote speaker one night, he made a little jab at Christianity. He was saying the theme of the conference was the power of stories, similar in a way to what I'm talking to you with right now. And he said, I could give you all the data and all the facts and all the scientific research proving evolutionary survival of the fittest, that we all rolled out of a mud puddle. I could give you all of that. But if you already have in your mind a story of intelligent design, of course you're going to go with the story. And his point was, see, that's the power of story. But did you catch what he did there? It's a little rhetorical hat trick he's played on the crowd. Because what he wants you to think is like, oh yeah, he's right. He's got facts. And you archaic, antiquated, obsolete Christians, all you have is a bedtime story. And because you're so ignorant and childish, you adopt the story because you like it. Whereas the real science is saying something entirely different. That is to misrepresent the whole of reality. Look, his version, let's call it the rolled out of a mud puddle version, is just as much a story as ours. They're both stories. It is really odd to insult one Christian gospel for being a story or just biblical creationism. It is really odd to insult it, to patronize it by calling it a story when right out the other side of your mouth, you're just telling me a different story. Okay, so our stories are different. One says that we were an accident. One says that we were created in the image of God. But they're both stories either way. In fact, in my limited perspective, it seems to me the prevailing story of our generation, of our time, the prevailing story that we live by and that our society as a whole builds itself off of is the story of what's called the blind watchmaker. I think that term came from Richard Dawkins, but I'm not positive who originally coined it. But the idea of the blind watchmaker, that nobody really created anything, no intelligent being, no God really created anything. We just continually improve by natural selection until we reach the point that we are now. That's the story. It's been written about very scientifically, et cetera, that must be where we came from. I can't help but think that story might just be our impression, something that we almost feel inclined to believe because of what we see around us with other things, like not biological creatures. Technology is an easy example. You have one year you have a horse and buggy, next year you have a horse and buggy with springs on it, so it's not so bumpy. Next year you have a horse and buggy with rubber tires and springs. And then the next year this guy comes by with a buggy with no horse. And he's got smoke coming out the back of it. How do you do that? And then years roll by and you have the Lamborghini. Okay? Things evolve and improve. And we witness that. How many of you can remember the first computer you had in your house? Think about that. I remember it. Actually, the first computer I ever saw was not in my house. It was in my grandma's house because my grandfather was very technologically interested. He wanted to have the latest gadget. It was hilarious. And it was an MS-DOS computer. This big thing. You know, the monitor was heavy. And then the computer was this separate tower that sort of sat down on the ground. And you could log into it. And if you were really lucky, you could type a paragraph or something. I mean, it had nothing on it. It was a very basic thing. It put off all this heat, fans blowing and noises and all. I'm sure it used a ton of electricity. Compare that to what all of us, carrying in our pockets right now. And just think, technology, I would say, has evolved. And so we see that all around us. From candles to fluorescent lights to LEDs. We see it everywhere we look. We see technology evolving. Go from a television that's this big and it's like a piece of furniture and you have one channel to a flat screen that's much bigger, weighs nothing, and has 100 channels. We see it all around us, and I just think the human story has sort of adopted that, like, oh yeah, maybe we were like that. Maybe we began as just basic organisms and just sort of accidentally, through natural selection, rolled out into this seemingly complex thing that we are today, and that it's nothing more than that. That's Dawkins' story. That's the story of the blind watchmaker, that nobody really designed it that way. It just worked out that way because over such an extreme periods of time. I can't help but think we're forcing a round peg through a square hole because we see it around us with technology so much. We can't help but think maybe that's the whole story from the get-go. And then on the other side, you have a very different story, mine, who believe that Adam and Eve were created in the image of God. Male and female, He created them. In the image of God, He created them. Not to get too derailed by this, but I happen to believe that even language was from the beginning. I don't think that language evolved. And I've told that story here before, so I won't go into it again when I preached here before, but I don't think language is just some sort of highly specialized series of grunts that just got better and better over the millennia. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. I may be a little bit in a smaller camp to say this, but I believe that language itself is divine. God didn't snap His fingers and let there be light, did He? And God said, let there be light. And I read a lot into that, and I take a lot from that. It is very interesting to me that there is not a single animal with language. Think about that. I hope you enjoyed this Bible story. Paul got the raw end of the deal, just like Jesus did. They told the wrong stories about Him until eventually, not in this particular iteration of it, but until eventually He was executed. And we know that Jesus was executed by the Romans and the Pharisees and the teachers of the law as well, because they didn't have their stories straight. So I thought it would be fitting if I could close this sermon with one other little story from the Bible. And it is a chilling story to me, and also the defining purpose of my life. The thing that I'm trying to prevent, and the thing that I'm trying to help, and the reason that I continue to preach and continue to teach. So if you would like, flip back to Genesis, and we're going to close with a different Bible story. And I'm sorry to leave you on a negative note, but this is not an encouraging Bible story. It's Genesis chapter 19, the destruction of Sodom. And because we're running out of time, I'll just give you the short version. You can start with me in verse 6. You're probably familiar with the tale. These two angels have been sent to Sodom to destroy it. They go and they meet Lot. They're going to spend the night in the square. Apparently these angels look like humans, as angels often do. There's often, as the Bible says, angels are among us. We entertain strangers because sometimes you're entertaining angels and you don't know it, that kind of thing. So they're going to spend the night in the square, like in the public street. And Lot, Abraham's nephew, says, you don't want to do that. No. You come in my house. Spend the night in my house. You don't want to spend the night out there. And they're like, no, we're fine out here. But he talks them into it. In the middle of the night, we find out why. People start pounding on Lot's door and they say, hey, what about those two men? You can read for yourself what they wanted to do with them. This is Sodom, remember. But I'm going to start in verse 6. Lot went outside to meet the crowd, and he shut the door behind him. And he said, my friends, don't do this wicked thing. Look, I've got two daughters who have never been with a man. Let me bring them out to you. And you can do what you like with them. Which, by the way, obviously, that's pretty messed up. Think like a parent for a minute. Sodom was a pretty messed up place. But don't do anything to these men, for they have come under the protection of my roof. Get out of our way, they replied. And they said, this fella came here as an alien. Lot, you came to us as an outsider. We'll treat you. You want to play the judge? We'll treat you worse than we treat them. Very threatening, a menacing crowd, a mob. And they kept bringing pressure on Lot, and they moved forward to break down the door. This is the end. The men inside, the angels, reached out and pulled Lot back into the house and shut the door. And then they struck the men who were at the door of the house, the mob, young and old, with blindness. The chilling part of that story, and this had never struck me until yesterday morning during my prayer time, and I'm reading through the Bible again, and so this is where I was. That one little phrase, young and old, really struck me. In this mob of rapists who were doing horrible things and were intending to do a very horrible thing were the young. How does a society get like that? How do you get this messed up, this tangled up? It's sadly simple. You immerse the young in your story from the get-go, and they'll never know any different. And whether or not and how much that applies to what's happening around us today, you decide. But I'm telling you, I told y'all 2 Bible stories today because I love Bible stories. And you do well to read them to your children and to your grandchildren and your great-grandchildren and to yourself. Join me in prayer. Dear Father, I thank you for a chance to share in this word today. I thank you that you told me your story through faithful messengers, through preachers, through the church calendar, through the Lord's Supper. I pray, God, that your story, the story of reality, will overwhelm all the noise in this world, the uproar that's telling me a million different things. That nothing's true, that nothing's real, that I'm not created, that I'm not loved because there's no God to love me. I think I've heard it all. I'd like to hear the truth every day, my daily bread. May that blessing come to this congregation even now. In Jesus' name, I pray.